The morning sun rose over the sprawling cornfields, casting long, golden rays across the land. The farm was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds overhead. Tom stood at the barn door, his hands resting on the weathered wood as he looked out at the land that had been in his family for generations. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with the first signs of a new planting season. For most, it might seem like an idyllic scene, but for Tom, it was a bittersweet reminder of all he had lost. Life on the farm had always been hard work, but it was rewarding. Tom had grown up here, learning the rhythms of planting and harvest from his father and grandfather. The cycle of the seasons was second nature to him now, as familiar as breathing. He had always imagined passing that knowledge down to his son, Jacob, who had shown an instinctive knack for farm life even as a young boy. Jacob had loved caring for the animals, especially the cows, with his gentle touch and easy laugh. But Jacob was gone now, taken in a tragic car accident that still haunted Tom's dreams. It had been nearly a year, but the pain hadn't dulled. Instead, it hung over the farm like a persistent storm cloud, darkening every corner of his life. Jacob's absence wasn't the only loss Tom faced. Julie, his wife of 15 years, had retreated into her grief so deeply that she felt like a stranger to him now. She had been the strong one at first, holding the family together in the days leading up to Jacob's funeral. But after the burial, her strength gave out. She stopped getting out of bed most days, letting the weight of her sorrow consume her. Tom had tried to help her, bringing her meals, encouraging her to step outside or even sit with him for a while. But she rarely responded. Her silence cut through him as deeply as her tears once had. The woman he had loved and built a life with seemed to have disappeared, leaving only a fragile shell behind. The burden of running the farm, once a shared responsibility, now fell entirely on Tom's shoulders. Planting season was the busiest time of year, demanding every ounce of his energy and focus. But even as he threw himself into the work, he couldn't escape the ache of grief that followed him everywhere. The farm buzzed with life, but for Tom, each day felt heavier than the last. The rhythmic demands of planting season consumed his time and energy, but the weight of grief never left him. Jacob's absence was a constant ache, a void that the farm's routines couldn't fill. His wife, Julie, only added to the burden. Her grief had taken on a life of its own, pulling her deeper into isolation. Julie spent her days in their darkened bedroom, the curtains perpetually drawn. She barely ate, rarely spoke, and avoided any reminder of the life they had shared before Jacob's death. Tom tried to reach her, bringing meals, offering quiet comfort, even suggesting small steps like stepping outside for fresh air, but his efforts seemed to bounce off an impenetrable wall of sorrow. With Julie so withdrawn, the full weight of the farm fell squarely on Tom's shoulders. The long hours of planting season stretched from dawn to dusk, leaving him physically exhausted and emotionally drained. The work was relentless, and though Tom had always prided himself on his ability to shoulder the farm's demands, it was becoming too much for one man to handle. The turning point came one evening as Tom reflected on the sheer impossibility of managing everything alone. The animals needed care, the fields needed attention, and the equipment required constant maintenance. Meanwhile, Julie's condition only worsened, leaving him with little emotional reserve to keep pushing forward. Seeking a solution, Tom stopped by his parents' house. His mother's suggestion to hire summer help planted a seed of hope. With the farm demanding so much, the idea of an extra pair of hands brought a sense of relief. That night, Tom resolved to seek out help first thing in the morning. The next day, Tom visited a local diner, where he heard about a teenager named Billy who had recently come to town. Billy was staying with his uncle after his parents left, and he seemed to need direction. Tom tracked him down at a nearby garage and offered him a job. Though hesitant, Billy eventually agreed to join Tom on the farm. That evening, Tom prepared the old bunkhouse near the barn for Billy's arrival. It had been unused for years, but with a little cleaning and rearranging, it became a cozy living space. Tom felt an odd sense of hope as he finished setting it up. Billy arrived the next morning, and Tom quickly introduced him to life on the farm. The teenager picked up the tasks quickly, showing an innate knack for machinery and a surprisingly gentle touch with the animals. Over the weeks that followed, Billy proved to be an invaluable addition. He worked tirelessly alongside Tom, lightening the load and bringing a fresh energy to the farm. With Billy handling more of the daily responsibilities, Tom found small moments to sit with Julie. Though she remained distant, he continued to quietly support her, hoping she might one day emerge from her grief. Little by little, her demeanor began to shift. She started eating more regularly and even ventured outside on occasion. As the summer passed, Billy's presence began to transform the farm. His hard work and easygoing nature made him a natural fit. Tom saw echoes of Jacob in Billy's care for the animals and his eagerness to learn. Slowly, a sense of normalcy began to return to the farm, though the wounds of loss were far from healed. Tom started to view Billy as more than just a farmhand. He became a part of the family, filling the void left by Jacob in ways Tom hadn't anticipated. The farm, once steeped in silence and sorrow, now hummed with the sounds of life and laughter again. As the summer days stretched on, the farm continued to thrive under Tom's watchful eye and Billy's tireless efforts. The once overwhelming workload became manageable, and for the first time in months, Tom allowed himself to feel a glimmer of optimism. Billy was not only a capable worker but also a presence that brought life back to the farm. Julie, too, began to stir from her grief. Small signs of her recovery appeared. She joined them for dinner on occasion, helped with lighter tasks, and even shared faint smiles that reminded Tom of the woman she used to be. However, beneath the surface, something began to shift. Tom started noticing moments between Julie and Billy that he couldn't quite explain. At first, it was small, a lingering conversation, an exchange of glances, but as the days passed, these moments grew harder to ignore. Their interactions seemed too familiar, too comfortable, and a nagging doubt began to take root in Tom's mind. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Tom returned to the house and found himself walking past Julie's office. The door was ajar, and he caught a glimpse of her sitting at her desk, Billy perched on the edge, deep in conversation. Billy reached out to touch Julie's hand briefly, and she leaned slightly toward him, her expression one of quiet comfort. Tom froze. The sight stirred something sharp and bitter inside him. It was a seemingly innocent gesture, but it felt far too intimate. He stood there for a long moment, debating whether to interrupt, but ultimately turned away, shaking his head as if to clear it. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that he was reading too much into their closeness. But the image lingered. In the following days, Tom's doubts grew. He began watching Julie and Billy more closely, picking apart every interaction for signs of betrayal. He noticed how often Billy seemed to find excuses to be near Julie, how their conversations were peppered with soft laughter, and how her demeanor brightened when he was around. Then came the day when Tom's suspicions were confirmed in the most devastating way. After finishing his evening chores, Tom went looking for Billy to discuss the next day's plans. When he didn't find him in the usual spots, he headed toward Julie's office. The door was closed, but faint voices carried through the wood. Tom hesitated, a knot tightening in his chest. He pushed the door open and froze at the sight before him. Julie knelt in front of Billy, her actions leaving no doubt about what was happening. The shock and betrayal hit Tom like a physical blow. Billy's wide-eyed expression turned to panic as he noticed Tom standing there, his face flushed with fury. Tom's body shook with anger, the pain of this ultimate betrayal ripping through him. He didn't speak at first, his silence heavier than any words could have been. When he finally found his voice, it was sharp and venomous. He demanded Billy leave the farm immediately, his rage spilling over as he dragged the young man out and threw him off the porch. Billy stammered apologies, but Tom was deaf to them. He watched as the teenager stumbled down the road, disappearing into the darkness. When Tom turned back to Julie, he found her sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She tried to explain, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. She spoke of loneliness, of grief, and of how Billy's kindness had filled the void Jacob's death had left. But her words offered no solace. Tom couldn't bear to look at her. The woman he had loved for so many years had shattered his trust in the most profound way. Without a word, he turned and left the house, retreating to the bunkhouse to spend the night. In the days that followed, the farm became a place of silence once more. Julie went to stay with her sister, leaving Tom alone to grapple with the anger and heartbreak that consumed him. The fields that had been his sanctuary now felt suffocating, and every corner of the house was a reminder of what he had lost, not just Jacob, but the trust and bond he had shared with Julie. The days following the betrayal were a haze of silence and exhaustion. Julie's absence weighed heavily on the farm, but for Tom, it was a relief not to face her. He threw himself into the work, his emotions simmering beneath a layer of routine. Anger, sorrow, and betrayal churned within him, leaving little room for anything else. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the bunkhouse, Tom found himself revisiting every moment that had led to this point: Jacob's death, Julie's retreat into grief, and the decision to bring Billy into their lives. He had thought he was building something strong, a new foundation for their family, but it had all been an illusion. Tom knew he couldn't stay in this limbo forever. Bitterness was eating away at him, and the betrayal had left scars he wasn't sure would ever heal. He began to formulate a plan, not just to move on, but to take back control of his life and his farm. Over the weeks that followed, Tom quietly began severing ties. He drained shared accounts, sold off surplus equipment, and made arrangements to restructure the farm's finances entirely in his name. He did it methodically, with the same precision he brought to his work in the fields. Julie returned occasionally to gather her belongings, always trying to bridge the chasm between them with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. But Tom's heart had hardened. He listened without responding, his silence an answer of its own. By the time the legal notices arrived, Julie seemed genuinely shocked. The farm was no longer hers in any meaningful way. Tom had positioned himself as the sole owner, leaving her no claim to their shared legacy. The realization hit her hard, and for the first time, Tom saw the weight of her regret etched deeply into her face. The foreclosure of their relationship was final. Julie's departure was quiet and unceremonious. Tom watched her leave for the last time, her figure small against the horizon as she drove away. Months passed, and winter set in, blanketing the farm in a stark, reflective stillness. The work of preparing for the next planting season kept Tom busy, but the solitude was unrelenting. The betrayal lingered, but so did a newfound sense of clarity. The life he had shared with Julie was gone, and all that remained was the determination to build something new from the ruins. By the time spring arrived, Tom was ready to start again. The fields outside his window promised renewal, their neat rows of young corn stretching toward the sky. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt the stirrings of hope. His heart was scarred, but he was still standing. Life on the farm continued, as it always did. But Tom had changed. He carried the lessons of betrayal with him, painful reminders of trust broken and the resilience he had found in himself. As he worked the land, he found solace in the steady rhythms of planting, growing, and harvesting. Sometimes, when the evenings turned quiet, he would look out over the fields and think about what could have been. But those thoughts no longer consumed him. He had let go of the past, and with it, the anger and bitterness that had once threatened to define him. The farm was still his home, but now it was also his sanctuary, a place to heal, rebuild, and find peace. Tom knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. And if you enjoyed this, feel free to follow for more stories and lessons from life's toughest moments.